The officer's boot struck the handcuffed man, a final act of dominance in court. He thought he was kicking a nobody. He had no idea he had just assaulted a Navy SEAL in front of a judge. The fluorescent lights of the suburban grocery store hummed a monotonous tune, a sound as bland and predictable as the Tuesday afternoon itself. Darius Cole moved through the aisles with a quiet economy of motion, his large frame navigating the narrow spaces with an unconscious grace. At 45, the retired Navy SEAL had traded the deserts of Iraq for the quiet streets of coastal Florida, seeking a peace that had been hard-earned. He was picking up groceries for a small barbecue, a rare gathering with a few men from his old SEAL team who now lived nearby. For them, he was just Darius, a brother. To the world, he was just a tall, powerfully built black man in a simple t-shirt and jeans. He arrived at the checkout with a full cart. 2 lanes were open. He chose the one with a shorter line, waiting patiently behind a white woman who was paying with a large handful of coupons. When her transaction was finished, Darius began placing his items on the conveyor belt. The cashier, a young woman with a bored expression, held up a hand. "This lane is closing," she said flatly, not making eye contact as she flipped the small plastic sign. Darius paused. "But the woman in front of me just checked out." "Yeah, well, now it's closed," she repeated, turning to organize her register. Darius looked at the other open lane. The line was now 6 people deep. He glanced back at the cashier. "I've been waiting for 10 minutes. Could you just ring me up? It would be quicker than me moving my entire cart." "I said, we're closed," she snapped, her voice edged with irritation. It was then that he noticed it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The way a few other shoppers were now looking at him, not her. The way the store manager, a thin, nervous man named Henderson, began walking over, his expression already apologetic but firm. Darius had seen this play before. It was a quiet, insidious form of social friction he knew all too well. "Is there a problem here, sir?" Henderson asked, addressing Darius, not his employee. "Your cashier just closed the lane after serving the previous customer." "I was just asking if she could check me out before she left," Darius explained, his voice calm and even. "I'm sorry, sir, but if the lane is closed, it's closed. You'll have to move to the other line." "I understand that," Darius said, still calm. "I'm just trying to understand the policy. Why was it open for one customer but closed for the next, in the span of 30 seconds? The question, logical and fair, was treated as an act of aggression. That's when Officer Ray Weller, who had been moonlighting as the store's security, decided to intervene. Weller was a man whose uniform seemed a size too small for his ego. He had a mean, dismissive smirk permanently etched on his face and saw the world through a prism of prejudice. He saw a large black man giving the manager a hard time. "You heard him," Weller said, stepping up beside the manager, his hand reflexively resting on his holstered sidearm. "Move along." Darius turned his head slowly to look at Weller. He assessed him in a fraction of a second, sloppy posture, overconfident, looking for a reason to escalate. Darius had faced down trained enemy combatants who possessed more discipline in their trigger fingers than Weller had in his entire body. He remembered a firefight in Fallujah, the air thick with bullets and chaos, where his teammates moved with a lethal, disciplined grace. Weller's aggression was just noise. It was amateurish. "Officer, this is a customer service issue, not a police matter," Darius said, his voice dropping slightly, carrying an authority that Weller immediately bristled at. "It's whatever I say it is," Weller snapped back. "Now I'm telling you to leave the store. You're causing a disturbance." "I'm causing a disturbance by asking a question." That was it. Weller saw his opening. "You're refusing to comply with a lawful order. You're under arrest." The absurdity of it was breathtaking. Before Henderson could protest, before other shoppers could fully process what was happening, Weller grabbed Darius's arm. The move was rough, unprofessional. Darius, whose body was trained to respond to threats with overwhelming force, did nothing. He allowed the officer to twist his arm behind his back, the surge of adrenaline in his own system suppressed by an iron will. He went limp, offering no resistance, knowing that was the only way to survive this kind of encounter. As the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, he looked past Weller, his gaze distant. He wasn't in a grocery store anymore. He was back in a place where survival depended not on fighting, but on enduring the madness of a broken world. The holding cell at the local precinct was a sterile, beige box that smelled of bleach and quiet desperation. Darius sat on the hard, concrete bench, the silence of the cell a stark contrast to the storm of injustice that had landed him there. The charge was, disturbing the peace and resisting arrest, a classic catch-all for when an officer's ego was bruised. He hadn't been allowed his phone call yet. They wanted him to sit. They wanted him to stew. They wanted him to break. But Darius Cole didn't break. He had been forged in crucibles far hotter than this drab, airless room. As he stared at the cinderblock wall, the concrete dissolved, replaced by the splintered, damp wood of a different kind of box, half a world away. The memory came unbidden, sharp and visceral. He was 22 years old, a young SEAL candidate in the final phase of SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. They had been captured after a simulated helicopter crash. For 3 days, he was a prisoner in a mock POW camp, run by veteran instructors whose cruelty was a calculated, educational tool. They were teaching him how to endure the unendurable. He remembered the cold. A deep, wet cold that seeped into his bones as he was forced to sit in a waterlogged pit for hours. He remembered the hunger, a gnawing emptiness that made every thought a struggle. But most of all, he remembered the interrogations. His primary interrogator was a retired Master Chief, a man with eyes like chips of flint who played the role of the enemy commander with terrifying authenticity. "You think you're tough, sailor," the Master Chief had snarled, his face inches from Darius's. They had him in a stress position, his muscles screaming in protest. "You think that trident on your chest makes you a man? You are nothing. You are a piece of meat. And you will tell me what I want to know." They used every trick. Sleep deprivation until the walls seemed to breathe. Disorientation, blasting noise and flashing lights. The psychological games were the worst. They told him his team had abandoned him, that his country had forgotten him. They gave him fake letters from home, filled with lies designed to break his spirit. Through it all, he held on to a single, anchoring thought, a mantra taught to him by his first training officer: they can take your body, but they cannot take your mind unless you give it to them. Control what you can control. Your breathing. Your thoughts. Your honor. So, he did. He focused on his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm. He mentally recited the names of every U.S. state in alphabetical order. He disassembled and reassembled his service rifle in his mind, piece by piece. He controlled his inner world, making it a fortress the outside world could not breach. On the final day, after enduring an experience that broke nearly half the candidates, he sat before the Master Chief for his debrief. The older man's face was no longer cruel. It was filled with a deep, weary respect. "You've got it, kid," he'd said, his voice raspy. "That place inside you. The quiet place. That's where a SEAL lives when everything else has gone to hell. Don't ever lose it." Darius brought himself back to the present, to the beige holding cell. He could hear Officer Weller in the squad room outside, laughing loudly as he recounted the story of the arrest, embellishing it for his colleagues. He was painting Darius as an aggressive, unhinged thug who had needed to be subdued. The lies were another form of interrogation, another attempt to break his spirit. But Weller didn't know about the quiet place. He didn't know he was dealing with a man who had been taught to find strength in silence, to find clarity in chaos. Weller thought he had caged an animal. He had no idea he had just locked himself in a room with a master of strategy, a man who was now calmly, methodically, planning his next move. The precinct wasn't a prison. It was an observation post. And from his concrete bench, Darius Cole was gathering all the intelligence he would need for the battle to come. The courtroom was an oasis of artificial calm, all polished wood and hushed tones. It was a stage for the theater of justice, and Darius Cole, now in a county-issued orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him, was the day's unwilling lead actor. His lawyer, Miles Trent, a sharp, dedicated public defender, sat beside him, his expression a mask of professional outrage. He had only been given the file an hour ago, but it was clear to him that this case was a farce. "The charges are ridiculous, Darius," Miles whispered. "Disturbing the peace? You asked a question. Resisting? There's not a mark on the arresting officer. We'll get this thrown out." Darius simply nodded, his gaze fixed forward. He wasn't focused on the legal strategy. He was focused on the man sitting at the prosecution's table, next to the young, nervous assistant DA. Officer Ray Weller was leaning back in his chair, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. He caught Darius's eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of dominance, of victory. He was enjoying this. The proceedings began. The prosecutor laid out the state's case, painting a picture of Darius as an aggressive, belligerent man who had threatened a store manager and then violently resisted a lawful arrest. The words were a work of fiction, a narrative constructed to justify Weller's prejudice. Darius listened to the lies without flinching, his face a calm, unreadable mask. His stillness seemed to unnerve the prosecutor, who began to stumble over his words. Judge Helena Barnes, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for sharp intellect and little patience for fools, presided from the bench. She watched the proceedings with a discerning eye, her expression neutral, but her gaze missing nothing. She noted the discrepancy between the prosecutor's depiction of a violent man and the composed, dignified individual sitting at the defendant's table. "The state calls Officer Ray Weller to the stand," the prosecutor announced. Weller swaggered to the witness box, took the oath with a self-assured air, and began to recount his version of events. His testimony was a masterclass in subtle exaggeration and outright falsehood. He described Darius as towering over the manager, his voice booming through the store, his posture threatening. "I determined he was a threat to public safety," Weller said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "When I attempted to de-escalate, he became combative, forcing me to use the necessary force to subdue him. It was during the cross-examination that the moment happened." Miles Trent, Darius's lawyer, began to poke holes in Weller's story. "Officer Weller," Miles began, "you state my client was combative. Can you describe his combative actions?" "He was non-compliant. He refused to follow my orders." "My client was asking a question about store policy, officer. Is asking a question now considered a combative act in this state?" His tone was aggressive, Weller insisted, his composure starting to fray. "So, you arrested him for his tone?" The courtroom was silent. Weller's smirk had vanished, replaced by a flush of anger. He felt his authority being questioned, his narrative crumbling. He looked over at Darius, who sat perfectly still, his cuffed hands resting on the table. Darius's calm seemed to mock him, to amplify his own growing rage. In that moment, something inside Officer Ray Weller snapped. He stood up from the witness stand, took 2 quick steps toward the defendant's table, and in a shocking act of brazen, contemptuous violence, he swung his foot. Time seemed to slow down. The courtroom watched in a collective, horrified gasp as the polished black leather of Weller's boot connected with Darius's side. The impact was a dull, sickening thud that echoed in the silent room. Darius grunted, his body lurching sideways from the force of the kick, the chair scraping against the floor. For a full 5 seconds, nobody moved. The prosecutor's mouth hung open. The bailiff's hand flew to his weapon, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. Miles Trent stared in stunned disbelief. And Judge Barnes, from her elevated bench, looked down with an expression of cold, crystalline fury. Officer Ray Weller had not just kicked the defendant. He had kicked the rule of law itself, in the very heart of its sanctuary. He had committed an act of war against justice, and he had done it in her courtroom. Darius absorbed the blow, a sharp, radiating pain spreading through his ribs. But beneath the pain was the familiar, cold clarity of combat. He didn't cry out. He didn't lunge. He slowly, deliberately, straightened himself in his chair, the clinking of his handcuffs the only sound in the tomb-like silence. He turned his head and looked at Officer Weller. It was a look devoid of hatred or anger. It was something far more terrifying. It was a look of profound, analytical pity. It was the look a master chess player gives his opponent just after the final, game-ending move has been made. Weller, who had expected fear or rage, faltered under that calm, penetrating gaze. He saw not a victim, but an enigma he couldn't comprehend, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear entered his eyes. Darius then turned his gaze from the disgraced officer to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a deep, calm resonance that carried to every corner of the room. "May I have permission to address the court?" Judge Barnes, her face a mask of controlled rage, stared down from the bench. She had seen 1,000 things in her courtroom, but never this. This brazen act of violence against a man in chains, an act of supreme contempt for her authority and the very institution she represented. Her mind raced, but her voice was steady. "Permission granted, Mr. Cole." Darius pushed his chair back slightly, not standing, but commanding the room from his seat. "Thank you, Your Honor." He did not look at the jury or the gallery. He spoke directly to the flag standing in the corner of the courtroom. "For 20 years, I wore the uniform of this country," he began, his voice quiet but unwavering. "I served in places most Americans only see in nightmares. I have been cold, I have been hungry, and I have been afraid. I have fought for the ideals that this flag represents, ideals of liberty, equality, and justice for all. I have fought alongside men of every color, creed, and background. I have buried teammates who looked like me, and teammates who looked like Officer Weller. We didn't see color in the dark of a firefight. We only saw the man next to us. We only saw a brother." He paused, letting the words settle. The room was spellbound. "I was taught that our uniform, our service, was a shield. Not for ourselves, but for the very people who might hate us, who might misunderstand us. We were sworn to protect their right to be safe, their right to speak, their right to due process. I came home from war believing in that promise. I came home believing that the system I fought to defend would, in turn, defend me." He slowly raised his cuffed hands. "And today, in this courtroom, I was proven wrong. Today, I was treated not as a citizen, not as a veteran, but as something less. I was kicked while in chains, by a man who swore the same kind of oath I did, to protect and serve." He looked down at his chest, then reached inside the collar of his orange jumpsuit. With his cuffed fingers, he painstakingly worked a thin, silver chain out from under the fabric. It took a moment, his movements slow and deliberate. Finally, he pulled it free. Hanging from the chain was a small, golden insignia. It was worn, its edges softened by years of being worn close to his skin, but its design was unmistakable. It was the Special Warfare insignia. The seal Trident. He let it rest on his chest, the golden eagle, anchor, and flintlock pistol catching the light. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. It was a sound of dawning, shocking recognition. A court reporter, a young woman, let out a small, audible sob. In the back row, an older man wearing a VFW hat slowly, reverently, removed it from his head. The air in the room had changed. He was no longer Darius Cole, the defendant. He was a United States Navy SEAL. A warrior. A hero. Judge Helena Barnes stared at the trident, and then at the man wearing it. Her own brother had been a Marine, lost in Beirut. She knew what that insignia meant. The years of sacrifice, the impossible training, the quiet, anonymous courage. And she knew what it meant for a man like this to be kicked like a dog in her courtroom. Her face, which had been a mask of cold fury, now hardened into something else entirely. It was the face of judgment. She stood up, her full height a declaration of absolute authority. She pointed a trembling but steady finger, not at Darius, but at the man who had assaulted him. "Bailiff," she commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. "Uncuff Mr. Cole. Now." The bailiff, who had been frozen in place, rushed forward and unlocked Darius's handcuffs. "Officer Weller," the judge continued, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "You are a disgrace to your uniform and an insult to this court. You have committed assault, perjury, and violated the civil rights of a decorated American war hero under the color of authority, in my presence." She lifted her gavel. "I find you in contempt of this court. And I am ordering your immediate arrest." The gavel fell with the force of a thunderclap. The sound echoed through the stunned silence of the courtroom, a definitive end to one man's career and the beginning of a story that would soon captivate the nation. "But you can't." Officer Weller stammered, his face a mess of confusion and disbelief. The smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by the pale, slack-jawed terror of a man who had just walked off a cliff he didn't see. "I can, and I have," Judge Barnes replied, her voice like ice. "Bailiff, take this man into custody." Two bailiffs descended on Weller, who offered no resistance. He was too shocked. They expertly spun him around and slapped the same set of handcuffs he had used on Darius onto his own wrists. The click of the cuffs was a perfect, ironic echo. As they led him away, past the defendant's table where Darius now sat, a free man, Weller's composure finally broke. "This is a mistake. I'm a cop." He was resisting, he yelled, his voice cracking. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic buzz of whispered conversations and the frantic scribbling of reporters. The young assistant DA looked ashen, realizing he had just prosecuted an American hero based on the lies of a corrupt cop. Miles Trent, Darius's lawyer, simply clapped his client on the shoulder, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Well," Miles said. "That's a first. I didn't even have to give my closing argument." Darius said nothing. He watched Weller being dragged out of the courtroom, not with satisfaction, but with a deep, profound weariness. The victory felt hollow, a sad confirmation of a truth he already knew. Outside the courthouse, the story had already begun to leak. The reporter who had been in the courtroom had live-tweeted the entire event. The first tweet, "Cop kicks handcuffed black defendant in the middle of a hearing," had started a ripple. The follow-up, "Defendant is a decorated Navy SEAL. Judge just ordered the cop arrested," was a tidal wave. By the time court was officially recessed, the news was the #1 trending topic in the country. The video, surreptitiously filmed by someone in the gallery, hit the internet an hour later. It was grainy, shot from a bad angle, but it was undeniable. It showed the kick. It showed the speech. It showed the stunning moment Darius revealed the golden trident on his chest. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans forums lit up with a white-hot fury. News channels broke into their programming. The police department's phone lines were flooded with angry calls. The governor's office issued a statement promising a full and immediate investigation. Darius, escorted out a back entrance to avoid the growing media circus, was driven home by Miles. His phone, finally returned to him, was buzzing incessantly. Calls and texts from his old SEAL teammates, from senators he'd provided security for on overseas trips, from generals at the Pentagon. The message was always the same: shock, outrage, and an unwavering offer of support. A former president, for whom Darius had once been part of a classified protection detail, called his personal cell. "Darius," the famous voice said, "I just saw the news. There are no words. What they did to you is a stain on the country you served. Whatever you need, you have it." Darius appreciated the calls, but he was tired. All he wanted was the quiet of his small house on the edge of town. He sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, a cup of black coffee in his hands. He hadn't sought this fight. But the fight had found him. And in that courtroom, by simply speaking his truth and revealing who he was, he had won it not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. The world was now watching, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope that things might actually change. The scales of justice, once so heavily tilted against Darius Cole, now moved with breathtaking speed. Officer Ray Weller was fired from the police force within 48 hours. He faced a litany of state and federal charges, from assault under color of authority to perjury and civil rights violations. His career was over, his reputation destroyed. The city, facing an unwinnable and explosive lawsuit, quickly moved to settle with Darius. But Darius, as he told his lawyer, didn't want money. He wanted change. He agreed to a settlement of $1, on one condition, that the police department implement a mandatory, comprehensive training program co-designed by retired military leaders and civil rights advocates. The program, later dubbed the Cole Protocol, focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and the constitutional rights of citizens. It became a model for departments across the country. Darius himself retreated from the spotlight. He turned down book deals and television interviews, politely declining requests to become the face of a movement. That wasn't his way. His heroism had always been in the quiet, unseen spaces. Yet, his town had changed. When he went to the grocery store, the manager, Mr. Henderson, personally opened a checkout lane for him, his face a mixture of respect and deep embarrassment. People on the street, who once might have crossed to the other side, now nodded in recognition. They didn't see a threat anymore. They saw a hero. One afternoon, as he was driving home in his old pickup truck, he stopped at a red light. A young boy, no older than 10, pulled up beside him on a bicycle. The boy stared at him, his eyes wide. "Hey," the boy said, pointing. "You're him. You're the Navy SEAL from the TV." Darius chuckled, a deep, warm sound. "Used to be, son." "You're my hero," the boy shouted, a huge grin on his face, before the light changed and he pedaled off down the street. Darius watched him go, and a genuine, unforced smile touched his lips. He drove home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the road. He hadn't fought for fame or accolades. He hadn't fought for revenge. He had fought, as he had always done, for the simple, quiet dignity of being seen for who he truly was. And in a small town, on a quiet street, a young boy's words were all the victory he would ever need. This story shows that one man's quiet dignity can be louder than a legion of bullies. If you were moved by Darius Cole's courage and integrity, like this video, subscribe for more incredible stories of justice, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that honor is the ultimate weapon. In the comments, tell us what you think true strength looks like.